Hi, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. My name is Dave Wallach, and I'm the Executive Director of Americans for Responsible Growth. We're a national advocacy group that works with state and local financial leaders, treasurers, controllers, and auditors who see firsthand how federal policies impact communities. Right now, Congress is gearing up to pass their major budget and tax bill that threatens to push American families deeper into an affordability crisis. We're going to highlight how this Republican budget agenda slashes essential services that millions of Americans depend on daily, and we leave Americans struggling to meet basic needs. As we begin, I'll note that we'll be recording this call to share out afterwards. We'll have time for Q&A at the end as well. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Massachusetts State Treasurer Deb Goldberg. Treasurer Goldberg.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. It's really hard to articulate the breadth of what this budget, specifically in hand with the other things that are going on through executive action and the like, has on a state like Massachusetts. We have long been a national leader in innovation, education, healthcare, research, biotech, high tech. So the attacks that go into our economy actually affect the entire country. When Washington scales back its commitments, it limits not only our state's potential, but the country's, because so much of what we do expands outside of our state. I've mentioned before, we don't have large farmland and we don't have oil wells. We have our brains, and that sort of comes from our teaching hospitals, our universities, and the conglomeration of people who work in these fields coming to Boston, settling in Boston, but doing all this research in Boston, which has life-saving implications and advanced development educations. Cutting all of this has direct implications on our state's economy and our ability to invest in our communities and our people. It completely negatively impacts our revenue resources and harms the long-term economic growth that we so rely on. Firstly, within terms of essential programs, one of the great things about us having universal health care in Massachusetts before Obamacare was that we were able to proactively get everyone within the healthcare system so that outcomes were more positive and people were not using emergency rooms as primary care physicians. That is the least expensive strategy for healthcare and better outcomes for people. Consequently, Medicare and Medicaid, cuts in those have enormous impact on us because everyone is basically, if they're not covered by private insurers, are within the mass health system. It harms our people. It takes away their ability to work. The long-term healthcare impacts for them individually means that they are going to cost more in the long run besides their own personal health. Federal grants not reflected in our state budget have grown significantly since the pandemic. Approximately 25% of our state capital spending is supported by federal funding. And in the governor's fiscal year 2026 budget proposal, federal funds would support more than 1/4 of all spending, but this blends together to create a very fiscally sound state with a AA+ bond rating that people throughout the country want to invest in. I'm going to use one example that is a really easy one to understand. Massachusetts Clean Water Trust heavily relies on federal grants through the EPA. What is it? We rebuild the water infrastructure. What are we hearing about going on in the Midwest right now? The poisoning of the water for all these kids in all these schools. Our program allows us to have a 0% or low interest loan through a revolving fund that rebuilds the water infrastructure throughout the entire state. The proposal in this budget is to slash $2.46 billion from the current $2.76 billion funding level. It's astounding. And what they said with it was, you've had enough already. You should have rebuilt all your infrastructure. It should be over. Well, every state has aging infrastructure, and you can't rebuild it all at once. And you've got healthcare implications here for children, for the schools, for everyone throughout the state. You don't have to be a brain surgeon to know that lead impacts brain development. This is very well understood. And so this is not even just an environmental necessity, but it impacts everyday people working for a living. Rebuilding water infrastructure are jobs, literally good paying jobs. You have the capacity to do significantly less projects. You're impacting people's jobs. I couldn't say enough, and so I think we all understand that what is happening to higher education, particularly here in Massachusetts, since one major university, which impacts all our teaching hospitals and all of our research, is under fire, and that's Harvard University. Massachusetts ranks third among all states in total amount of NIH research funding and is first on a per capita basis. That combination of the universities, the hospitals, and the research is fundamentally part of our entire economy here in Massachusetts. So when this budget says we're going to push everything back to the states, how is that going to make it happen? I really feel strongly that we need Congress to reconsider this and to start thinking proactively about what makes America tick and what the individual states have to add to a vibrant economy. They're going to affect people from the very poorest through working families. Working families are going to suffer the most, and our state is going to be very negatively impacted. These are not abstract. They are personal, and they're going to affect every single family in this state. And what happens here is going to affect the rest of the country. Thank you.
Thank you, Treasurer Goldberg. Now we're going to move on to Illinois State Treasurer Mike Frerichs. Treasurer Frerichs.
Right. Thanks, Dave. So it's not very difficult to be a Monday morning quarterback to a president who runs afoul of the rules. Now, if I were a coach on the other side, I would tell my team a few things. Expect them to play dirty. Expect them to pout and blame it on the media when they get a bad call. And expect them to own the refs to ensure loyalty. Because in Trump's world, cheaters always win. We know this to be true. For Trump, everything has a price. Only tax-paying, hardworking Americans can't afford to buy into this game. So get ready to get hoodwinked again. At stake in Congress right now is something we have come to take for granted. The Affordable Care Act, repeatedly targeted by Republicans over the last decade, is credited with improving access to health care, making health care more affordable, increasing the number of Americans insured, and slowing the cost of growth in health care. Trump and his cronies in the House are eyeing your health care and that of your parents, your children, your friends, and your neighbors. House Republicans are executing the play Trump called for, running up the score on regular Americans by slashing health care so he can hand off his beloved tax cuts to the ultra-wealthy. $715 billion in cuts to health care. That's right, $715 billion. Millions of Americans will lose access to health care. Hundreds of thousands of them here in Illinois. And if they can go to the doctor, they can expect to pay even more. Once again, Trump and Speaker Johnson will rob the poor to enrich the rich. And guess who loses here? When those benefits are cut, the states lose, and that means people lose. States don't have an extra $715 billion in revenue to step in. As Americans, we already pay federal taxes. What Trump Republicans are proposing is a budget that takes the taxes you pay and dramatically cuts the programs that keep hearts ticking and cancers at bay to afford tax cuts for the rich. It's not just Democratic treasurers who oppose these healthcare cuts. 4 out of 5 Americans oppose cuts to Medicaid. Americans voted for Trump because they envisioned a stronger economy, a lower cost of living, and more affordable housing. Instead, we're paying more for groceries, clothing, and electronics through Trump's chaotic, incoherent tariff war. All the while, Trump's family is building billion-dollar towers with Bitcoin, accepting airplanes from foreign interests, dining with their donors, and taxing Barbies and G.I. Joes. That's if you can even find them on the store shelves in time for Christmas. The only thing that won't be taxed are lumps of coal. President Trump pulls from the same playbook every time. He tells people what they want to hear and gives us the opposite. And when people cry foul, Trump creates a distraction. Americans need to ignore the distraction. Let's pause and check out the instant replay and see exactly what's going on. Call your members of Congress today. What we need right now is an interception or a quarterback sack. We cannot afford not to speak out. Our livelihoods, our quality of life, and our health care are on the goal line. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we're going to move to Houston Controller Chris Hollins. Controller Hollins.
Thanks, Dave, and thank you all for being here. It's a privilege to join you, and I want to thank Americans for Responsible Growth for convening this group of public servants on what is such a critical topic. Today, as you can see, financial officers from across the country are raising our voices because the stakes, simply put, could not be higher for American families. Republican lawmakers are pushing to slash $1 trillion from programs that millions of Americans rely on. Programs like Medicaid, free and reduced school lunches for our young people, and Meals on Wheels for our seniors. These are not luxuries, they are essentials, and they're about survival, they're about dignity, they're about basic decency. Right here in Houston, nearly 60% of our public school children depend on free or reduced lunch just to get through the school day. 1 in 5 seniors in the state of Texas is at risk for hunger. And every single day right here in Houston, more than 4,000 of our most vulnerable neighbors rely on Meals on Wheels services, not just for food, but for a human connection and for a lifeline in time of need. This proposed budget doesn't just cut numbers. It cuts meals, it cuts medicine, it cuts hope. And as we think about this, you know, there are people, there are families, there are individuals who are behind every single one of those numbers. Now, we're being told that there's not enough money to feed our kids, to take care of our seniors. But somehow there's always enough money for another billionaire tax break. That is not fiscal responsibility. That's a failure of American values. What are we saying to our children when we choose tax cuts for the wealthy over lunch in their cafeterias? What are we saying to our parents when they've made sacrifice after sacrifice their entire lives, and we pull care from them in their later years when they need it most? In Houston, we believe in showing up for each other, and Congress should be doing the same. Our families are doing their parts. They're working hard, they're paying taxes, they're stretching every dollar as things become more and more expensive in the Trump economy. It's time elected officials in Washington did their part too. And no, Treasurer, I don't mean Washington State. We appreciate you, brother. But it's time that those in the District of Columbia step up to the plate here. We need a budget that invests in people, not one that invests in perks for the powerful. We need a budget that feeds children, one that cares for the sick, one that creates opportunity, and one that ensures that no senior has to wonder where their next meal is coming from. Anything less than this is not leadership, it's abandonment. And it's time that Congress chooses a side. And today we're calling on them to stand with hardworking American families. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, we're going to go to Washington State Treasurer Mike Pellicciotti. Treasurer Pellicciotti.
Well, hello, and thank you everyone for being here. My name is Mike Pellicciotti. I'm the treasurer from the other Washington, the state of Washington. It's great to stand with my colleagues today to defend the important services provided by our federal government. From a Republican budget proposal that would continue the trajectory of wealth distribution to the already wealthy. The proposed budget would not put America first, but puts America last. Let me explain why. The narrative of these tax cuts is woefully out of date. Republicans are pushing this Reagan-era thinking that if we just free up capital for the wealthiest Americans, that it will be reinvested and somehow stimulate domestic economies, expand employment, and share the wealth for all. But the dated view that massive tax breaks for the rich are going to translate into new domestic manufacturing facilities or local job creations is dangerously naive. Due to immense volatility in the American trade policy today, investors and businesses are rethinking capital strategies in the United States. We're seeing investors pause investments in the US and look abroad for opportunities, fearing they may no longer be able to rely on sound economic policy in America. The rules-based order that has dominated for nearly a century is undergoing an immense stress test, and those with the wealth and capital to insulate themselves and adapt to this new reality are going to do so. Which begs the question, what exactly do Republican lawmakers believe the ultra-wealthy who would most benefit from these tax cuts intend to do with that money? The reality is the ultra-wealthy are investing their investment portfolios abroad in increasing amounts. The programs and services being targeted in budget talks are essential for Americans. Healthcare, food assistance, retirement, this would be a massive loss of domestic investment. When you look at the totality of the impact from tariffs, executive action, and the proposed budget, we have a combination that will liquidate needed services for middle and low-income families, to free up cash for the wealthiest Americans to invest in foreign economies. These reckless federal economic policies and budget tactics risk a dramatic impact that simply isn't worth risking. We'll see costs rise, an increased burden on the middle class, and a gutting of services precisely when Americans would need them most. And given additional capital via tax breaks, we would expect that wealthy investors will continue to move their money overseas. The finance industry and private equity firms are going to do what earns their clients the greatest profit, not what drives broad wealth creation for the American working family. That means more hard-earned tax dollars from working families, from Americans, will go to foreign countries. Let's not delude ourselves. Tax breaks to put more money in the hands of the wealthy will not efficiently translate into private U.S. investment. This myth has been costly, it has exploded American debt, and slowed economic growth. All of this while eliminating programs that pay for healthcare services, infrastructure, and support for families and children at the most domestic level. The Trump administration has taken a hammer to the International Order of Trade. We simply cannot afford a Republican budget that willfully ignores these shifting conditions. We urge Congress to prioritize investing in Americans, not freeing up cash for the wealthy to invest abroad. Thank you.
Thank you, Treasurer Pellicciotti. Now we'll move on to Colorado State Treasurer Dave Young. Treasurer Young.
Thank you for the introduction, Dave. I'm Dave Young. I'm the Colorado State Treasurer, and I'm grateful to Americans for Responsible Growth for pulling us together. We've been doing this for months, and I'm happy to join my colleagues again to sound the alarm on the proposed federal budget. You know, there's an old saying that says the budgets reflect our values. I know this distinctly because I worked for 4 years as a member of our budget committee here in the state of Colorado. But when we look at the president's budget, it's clear what he values: billionaires and corporations over hardworking families. If the president gets his way, the wealthiest Americans will receive an historic tax break, while millions of vulnerable Americans will have the safety net ripped out from underneath them. Not only is this profoundly cruel, it's economically devastating. Projections show that the plan will drive up inflation, raise already high interest rates, and explode the national debt by almost $5 trillion. As treasurer, I'm compelled to speak out against policies that destabilize our state and national economy. I urge Congress to use its congressional power and rein in the president before his harmful agenda goes through. While President Trump lives in an imaginary fiscal environment. My colleagues and I operate in the real world. And out here, the stakes could not be higher. Colorado is already facing a persistent budget shortfall. In this most recent legislative session, we took pains to close a $1.2 billion deficit caused primarily through funding Medicaid. Ending federal funding will force our state to backfill cuts or slash essential programs, directly harming the most vulnerable Coloradans. Take food assistance, for example. More than 500,000 people in Colorado rely on SNAP benefits in our state. Meals on Wheels serves about 25,000 seniors annually. Without access to nutritious foods, Coloradans will turn to unhealthy options or skip meals altogether. This will plunge more families into food insecurity and will only compound our state's healthcare crisis. Colorado children are also collateral damage here. In our state alone, about 100,000 children and caregivers rely on WIC for parenting, nutrition, and other wraparound services. About 11,000 kids benefit from Head Start programs. As a longtime educator, I know how important these services are to children's futures. Investing in their development today helps them become thriving adults tomorrow, powering long-term economic growth. I'm also deeply concerned about Medicaid. As I've referred to many times before, my sister Dorothy is cognitively and physically disabled. She is one of the 1.2 million Coloradans who rely on Medicaid for life-sustaining care. Sadly, I know what it's like for a loved one to lose care. My sister spent months on the street when a cash-strapped Colorado reduced benefits over 20 years ago. It was a gut-wrenching experience that no one should have to go through, let alone one of the state's most vulnerable people. I'm all for reforming Medicaid, and that's why I ran for office in the first place. When I was in the State House, I passed legislation that would actually reform Medicaid, result in better outcomes for people, and save money. But Elon and the president are not acting in good faith. Instead of proposing targeted solutions, President Trump has taken a sledgehammer to bedrock programs like that people like my sister Dorothy depend on every day. From months of chaos, we know that targeting waste, fraud, and abuse is just a convenient excuse to gut services. And that's why we must do everything we can to push back against the president and demand a better deal for the American people. President Trump's budget provides a clear statement. He has and will continue to put billionaires over working families. The plan actively robs critical funding for seniors, disabled people, and children to subsidize the extravagant lifestyles of Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg. This budget betrays our Americans' values, and it should be soundly and swiftly rejected by Congress. And here's my key message and takeaway for today. I urge every one of our Colorado congressional delegation to stand up for everyday Coloradans and ensure that their sustainability is preserved by pushing back on these deep budget cuts. Thank you.
Thank you, Treasurer Young. And I'm going to start with the first question. Treasurer Young, you've answered it in depth, but let me put it to everybody else. If Congress moves forward with cutting $1 trillion from essential programs like Medicaid, SNAP, and school lunch programs, what specific impacts would your offices anticipate for your budgets and the communities you serve? Would anybody like to start out with this question?
Well, I'll go. Oh, sorry. I'll go first.
No, go right ahead.
I mean, look, there's no way any state government can clean up the mess from an elimination of Medicaid dollars. I think that there's been a promise made between the states and the federal government that the federal government will provide its share of the federal healthcare dollars, and any reduction in any amount from the federal government will have a huge impact in the services that can be provided to local states. And it's state treasurers like us that have to clean up the mess from the federal government from any new budget changes they put in place. It not only will eliminate essential services in our state, but states like ours here in Washington State that have expanded healthcare services through our Apple Health program will be disproportionately impacted because of what would essentially be a change in the promise that has been made by the federal government to provide these healthcare services to the people of our states.
Well, and I'll just dive in and just add to, a little more depth around the issue of Medicaid cuts. We have rural hospitals around the state, and I am the only statewide elected constitutional officer here in the state of Colorado that lives in rural Colorado. I live north of Denver, about 60 miles in Greeley. And, I'm around the state. I hear from rural hospitals that the cost of providing uncompensated care when Medicaid is cut and people, as Treasurer Goldberg referred to, go to the ER for primary care, overwhelms them. And, there's already been mental health hospitals that have closed here in Colorado. And we are worried about the shutdown of emergency services in rural Colorado, forcing people to drive hours one way in an emergency to seek services. So, these have direct impacts on the lives of people. This is not a partisan issue. This is an issue that affects people in every corner of our state.
Okay, I'm going to move on to the next question. What are you all hearing from your constituents about these proposed budget cuts, and how does that compare to what we're hearing from Republican lawmakers in Washington?
I'm going to jump in on that because Massachusetts, from a square mileage perception, is pretty small. And there are areas of the state that did vote for the president. And what we are hearing is a lot of real shock. It is actually some of our different, less financially capable communities that are being deeply affected. The whole issue around food, basic services, education. These communities are very, very reliant on education dollars, healthcare. I mean, across the board, people are starting to say, this is not what we voted for. I'm hearing that over and over and over again. This is not what we voted for. This is not what we wanted. Incredible increased demand on the food banks, and the food banks are getting less dollars. So it is all the nonprofits that serve communities across the state have seen contributions dry up. Cost of going to the grocery market has not improved. Scares about potential inflation coming from tariffs and the volatility of that has people frozen in place. They don't know what to spend or not what to spend. Housing costs, rebuilding and renovations of schools across the state, everything is stalled out. And we are going through our budgeting season right now and know that very soon we're going to have to sit down and reevaluate our own internal budget for Massachusetts, knowing that the economy overall is going to see less and less revenues as we move into the months going forward. But our constituents are truly surprised.
Yeah, I'll just add more of the same. When I go out and I talk to people who voted for President Trump, what I frequently hear is, we didn't vote for this. He said we were going to have great healthcare, we wouldn't lose our healthcare, and that's clearly not true. He said he'd bring down prices on day one. Not only did they not go down, in many cases they have gone up. They said it'd be great for business, but many of my farmers are seeing a decrease in the price they're going to get for their crops and an increase in the cost of inputs. It's clear they realized they were sold a false bill of goods. And you would think that their elected representatives in Congress would be speaking on their behalf. But what we hear from Republicans in Congress is silence. We hear crickets. I think that it is time for them to push back, to listen to their constituents and stop listening to dear leader. It is important that they understand who puts them in office. It is the people who are hurting. But too often they think that it's the president who they are ultimately accountable to.
Okay, I want to bring in a question that, Treasurer Goldberg, you touched on this, but it's a question from Bloomberg. They're working on a story about how the budget affects state by state access to SNAP. Can you all react to the impact that Trump's budget will have on food assistance programs?
I can go ahead, Mr. Controller.
Well, I touched on this a little bit here. Our major school district here, Houston Independent School District, 60+% of those young people rely on free lunch, and that is a real challenge, right? If that's the only meal that they're getting in a day. But specifically, if we're focusing on SNAP, it's even more significant. Over 600,000 residents of Harris County, here where Houston is situated, rely on SNAP for proper nutrition. And on average, those families or individuals are saving about $200 a month by using SNAP services. If they don't have access to that, what are they doing? Well, they're rationing food. They might be rationing medicines that they're paying for with those savings. And as you know, if you're rationing food, what you're doing is you're being, you're under, nutrition. You are, if you're rationing medicines, you're going without in a way that can be dangerous to your health, particularly with certain conditions. And so this is a real critical issue. And then you think about other important household needs and costs like rent. You can't ration your rent. And so if you're getting behind on your rent because you no longer have access to pay for food, which you need on a daily basis, now you're at risk of eviction. Now you're at risk of being homeless. And so these are challenges that spiral for families and for individuals who are in need. And as I've mentioned in my other comments, and my colleagues have mentioned as well, these are not luxury services that Americans rely on. These are critical services. These are things that they need day in and day out for survival. And Americans are doing the right thing. These are hardworking families that access these services. And this little bit helps them get by, helps them make ends meet in a way that they won't be able to do if these services all of a sudden disappear.
And I'll just jump in. I referred in my comments to the 500,000 people here in the state of Colorado that rely on SNAP. The other point that I want to make, and it's really specific to Colorado, Colorado has the most restrictive tax and expenditure provision of any state in the country, and it's embedded right in our Colorado Constitution. The voters voted in the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, TABOR, and as a result, we have limited ability to respond to significant impacts economically, like a recession, also to significant budget cuts that are being proposed here. We don't have the capacity. We don't have the rainy day funds that would allow us to backfill these losses. And so the impacts are going to be significant. Essential services in other places are going to get cut as well, as we try to jockey through a maze that doesn't have an output, a place to get out.
I'd like to just add a little extra data to all this. And Treasurer Young mentioned the rainy day fund. And a lot of people say, well, why not just use the rainy day fund? Number one, I want to mention, rainy day fund will disappear, and that will happen very quickly if we begin plugging operational costs with the rainy day fund. What happens when you no longer have a rainy day fund? Well, one of the things that can happen, and you won't have it the following year to plug budgets, but your bond rating will also go down. And so the additional costs to try to backfill all sorts of things cut by the federal government will be more costly. But in Massachusetts, with respect to food assistance, we can't make that up, because I want to give you the statistics. More than 50% of SNAP participants have children. 48% have family members who are elderly or disabled, And 33% of SNAP recipients are full-time working people, which shows that their overall costs, even if they are able, and when you say full-time working people, you're talking about all members of the adult family, that the cost of food on top of the cost of rent, on top of the cost of heating, on top of the costs of transportation are tremendous. If you're taking food away, the healthcare impacts, brain development, again, all those things are significantly impacted.
I'll just add one quick thing here. Donald Trump and Elon Musk gutted funding for critical programs like Meals on Wheels, Medicaid, and SNAP. So the average is $6.16 a day for seniors, kids, and people just scraping by. That's a bologna sandwich for lunch and mac and cheese for dinner. And I just asked, could Trump survive on $6 a day? That's not even enough for his Big Mac meal. Food banks, schools, and our own Illinois farmers have been targeted by these ruthless and unnecessary cuts. Two of the programs that were eliminated allowed Illinois farmers to sell their fresh food to community partners like Meals on Wheels and food pantries. When SNAP funding and funding for food pantries are both slashed, that's a 1-2 punch for folks who don't know where the next meal is coming from and the organizations that help them out.
And we have the same exact situation. The SNAP recipients get $6.40 a day. That's what they're getting now.
And if I can just speak to the SNAP issue, it's the same in Washington State, where 1 in 9 Washingtonians receive SNAP benefits. And like Treasurer Goldberg mentioned in Massachusetts, in Washington State, a majority of those receiving benefits are families with children. But I want to go back to my initial comments, which is these funds that would be going to healthcare services through a reduction in Medicaid, or that would be going to food services in a reduction of SNAP benefits, are essentially money that would be going to domestic production. When we're talking about healthcare benefits, those are dollars going to nurses, to doctors, to healthcare clinics. When we're talking about SNAP benefits, that is money going to local agricultural production. 1 in 9 Washingtonians receiving food means food production locally here in Washington State that would be evaporated. And this domestic investment in the state of Washington or in domestically for Americans across the country is instead going to go to the wealthiest Americans who will, at an increasing percentage, are going to send that money overseas. It is an ultimate sucking of domestic dollars to foreign investors and the most wealthy foreign entities abroad. And we can't be any more clear that we are literally putting America last instead of America first. And it's very important to highlight that fact.
So to build on that, I just want to ask one more question, then we'll close up for today. Many of you have laid out how these cuts could hurt families directly, but what about indirect costs? How might these budget cuts ripple through your state or your city economies beyond just the immediate impact on program beneficiaries?
Well, Dave, I mentioned in my previous response about our constitutional restrictions in the state of Colorado, and if we're cut and forced to make hard decisions about providing health care to people, for example, or food to people, I mean, these are horrible, horrible choices, then other essential services then end up also being cut drastically. And I worry as a former educator about the cuts to local school districts and the fact that we already have some of the lowest competitive salaries for teachers in the country. If we cut support for our 178 school districts across the state and charter schools as well, what are we going to end up with as far as an outflow of teaching professionals leaving the state seeking better salaries? So these impacts do ripple, and they do have effects. If it's done the right way, they can be a positive ripple, but these impacts are going to have a negative ripple and really devastate communities across our state.
I would like to jump in one last time because the indirect costs are just so fundamental to the existence of Massachusetts' entire economy. The ecosystem, which I think I've mentioned before, is our economic driver for everything we do in Massachusetts. You impact jobs, you impact the sales tax, for example, because there are less people shopping. A penny on the sales tax is what we use to rebuild or renovate very old school buildings. Kids need 21st century buildings in order to learn the skills that they need to be able to fill the jobs of the 21st century. But that's just one example. Our entire ecosystem is impacted. And I say it often, I'll say it again. This is what Massachusetts research is. It's research, innovation, development, the growth of high-tech businesses. They employ people. We have to have more money to build housing and transportation infrastructure. Our entire ecosystem is being impacted by everything that has happened in 100+ odd days. And for what? That is the whole thing that every financial officer on this call has discussed. For the people, to give tax cuts for the people who need it the least.
I'll say budgets are finite dollars. Legislatures have to make decisions out there. If we have cuts for healthcare costs, hospitals are going to make decisions. They're either going to raise the prices on the rest of us, or they're going to cut back and people lose access to healthcare. If the states decide to chip in and help out, that's less money for our schools, for our universities, for our roads and bridges. There are ripple effects, indirect effects all throughout the economy because, yes, over time, we hope to grow our economies. But this cycle, budgets are finite, revenues are finite, and we have to make tough choices. As I said earlier, we send taxes off to Washington, D.C., but they don't want to send them back to the states.
Yeah, and just one more thing on potential second and third order effects. Treasurer Goldberg mentioned earlier what happens when more people are getting their primary care at the ER. That's a cost that's going to be imposed on the rest of us very, very soon. In my remarks on the SNAP question, we talked about what happens if folks, have to pay more for food and now are paying less for medicine. Have to pay more for food, now can't cover their own housing. If homelessness goes up, that's going to be a tax on our entire city economy. And we're already under-resourced when it comes to police and public safety. And now we'll have a whole new set of issues. We know for a fact that higher poverty leads to higher rates of crime. And so we're going to see areas of Houston that are already struggling and, again, need more help now getting attacked in a different way. And so let's help the folks who need it the most. Under President Biden, when we saw child poverty cut in half, we saw what the results of that were, which is, crime coming down in the wake of the pandemic, so much more comfort and safety and security for Americans who need it the most and who are also working hard and paying taxes. And so that's what we should be trying for, and these cuts seek to accomplish just the opposite.
Great. Thank you, treasurers. Thank you, Controller Hollins. Appreciate you being here, and thank you to all of you who've joined us. We'll be sharing the recording of this Zoom a little bit later today. If you have any questions, please feel free to follow up with me or with Focal Point Communications. Thanks so much. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody. Take care.
Thank you all.